or it fails. Now, I can give you an example of this, okay? So, how many of you have seen Disney's Sleeping Beauty? Okay, so many of you have. How many haven't? Okay, so there's a few that haven't. Well, the Disney movies, you know, they're kind of standard childhood fare. Now, in Sleeping Beauty, what happens is that the king and queen give birth to a princess after trying for a substantial amount of time. And, you know, she arrives healthy and beautiful, and then they have a christening day, and they invite everybody to it, but they don't invite Maleficent, who's a dark witch, roughly speaking. You know, like she's queen of the underworld, that for lack of a better word. She's the negative element of femininity. And they don't invite her to the party. And so she shows up anyways and says that because they didn't invite her, their daughter's going to die when she hits 16, which is, you know, roughly the age of, let's say, sexual maturation for a story of that sort. Now, there's another little positive magic female in the story who mitigates that death sentence to protracted sleep. Well, the idea behind it, it's a very, very interesting story. It's an Oedipal story in a sense, because what it says is that if your parents protect you too much from the dark side of life when you're young, that what will happen when you start to on the road to maturity is you'll be so naive and so fragile that you'll want to be unconscious instead of paying attention, and that you're going to have to be rescued from that state by something. And it could be a prince, which is how that story lays itself out, or it also could be the symbolically masculine and exploratory element of your own psyche. And the stories are ambivalent about whether it's an external event or an internal event. It doesn't really matter. You know, the things end up being the same. And so that's actually what happens in the Sleeping Beauty story. You know, at the end, a prince who's also enslaved by this terrible negative feminine force manages to escape, and the Maleficent turns into a dragon, and he has to fight her, and then he goes and rescues the princess, and she wakes up, and the kingdom's rejuvenated, and everybody's happy. It's a classic story. You know, and it's funny because the Disney movie Frozen was put forward as in some sense, as a feminist alternative to the classic fairy tales. And first of all, you can't do that. You can't just generate up a fairy tale. You know, there's recent evidence that some of these fairy tales, the ones that the Grimm brothers and Hans Christian Andersen collected, are up to 10,000 years old. You can't just come up with a counter fairy tale. That's just not how it works. And the way that fairy tale is structured, it has nothing to do with the necessity for anyone to rely on anyone else for anything. It's a complex portrayal of the dynamic relationship between archetypal characters. And, you know, it's one form of the story. There's lots of different forms of the story. But what I like about Sleeping Beauty, for example, and this is what's nice about the real fairy tales, is that along with the positive, there's negative, and it's real negative. Like, real fairy tales are terrifying. Like, who is it? Is it in Sleeping Beauty or in Snow White? I don't remember. In one of the famous Grimm fairy tales, one of the evil sisters ends up dancing in red-hot shoes till she dies. You know, they're very, very violent and unsettling, and it's because they have the quality of genuine folk tales. But the reason for that is because they're dealing with real things. Like the Hansel and Gretel story is a good example of that, right? Kids are abandoned out in the woods. They find something that's too good to be true. Inside this thing that's too good to be true is something that wants to fatten them up and devour them. It's a rough story. But what it's doing, the stories have evolved to represent the fundamental dynamic elements of existence if you conceptualize existence in terms of character. And the thing is, you have to conceptualize existence in terms of character if you're a person, because what you do in existence is act out your character. So your character is an element of existence. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't mean that society has a character. But actually, it does mean that. And because partly what happens, like if you're socialized, say, into a culture, the culture exists in the same relationship to you, roughly speaking, as another person does. So, for example, if you put money in the bank, which is in principle a representation of your labor, what you're doing is entering into a contract with the broader social world, which is one of promise, essentially, where the future society promises to return your value at a future date. So it's a contractual relationship. And the reason that God the Father is a very common representation is because treating the they in Heideggerian terms, the others in Heideggerian terms, as if they're an embodied entity actually works.